This is supposed to be a depressing subject, but I've had some of the best laughs of my life at these conferences and listening to what people have to say. What we're going to do this afternoon, this is an opportunity that we haven't put together before at ASPO. 3 hours in 2 separate panels, 3 hours in which you can listen to some people that are on the front lines reporting this story and analyzing this story and ask some questions of your own. We're going to, maybe just a brief introduction of the panelists and a couple of questions to get us started here. And then I'm going to go back and tell you a little bit more about each one of these folks as they give their take on what's happening with the peak oil story and how they've been approaching it. To my left here, Neil King Jr. of the Wall Street Journal, Erica Etelson, who writes periodically for the Chronicle, the LA Times, and other papers, as well as doing some public affairs work in Berkeley. Bart Anderson, known to a lot of you as the editor of Energy Bulletin. I just want to start with a question for any of the three of you. This issue's changed a lot in the last few years as far as media attention. People, to me, don't seem to be regarded as extreme as they might be, but I'm curious to know if you find that among journalists and editors, are there still people out there that think that the peak oilers are sort of extremist, chicken little wackos? Do you still run into that periodically?
I could talk a bit about that. I mean, it's definitely the case that this year has been a sea change on that front. I mean, it's somewhat reflected in the various pieces that we've done at the Journal. But I don't know if it was on the oil drummers where I'd read at one point when people were gleefully citing just the increases of the term peak oil and its occurrence on Google and Google News and so on. I mean, there was, you know, maybe there'll be a PowerPoint chart showing the occurrence rate of the term. But I think there's definitely been a higher acceptance. On the other hand, I'm still not totally convinced that some of the perception isn't driven primarily by price and the kind of pain threshold level that people are experiencing at that time. And it's going to be interesting to see where prices go, obviously, going forward into next year, but also where the alarm level remains, politically speaking, and just sort of among the populace. And I mean, there was a great reflection in sort of what the alarm level should be during the summer, and now, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty about what that whole uptick in prices meant, and are we going to go back there and when, and so on. So I'm not sure the debate is done in the public perception.
Erica, Bart, are we mainstream now?
Well, I think it's getting better. I think it was in 2005, peak oil had the dubious distinction of being named one of the most censored stories of the year. And believe me, there's a lot of competition for that award. And I don't know that we would win that award again, I'm glad to say, but I don't think we can really say we've arrived in the mainstream until the use of the term peak oil really is not just increasing, as Neil mentioned, but is really a standard part of any article about energy and oil and natural gas. I mean, it seems like a petty point in some ways, like, come on, say peak oil, just say it. But it is important, and here's why. When I first heard about peak oil, it was about a year ago, and a neighbor mentioned it to me, and he told me about Hubbard's Peak, and we're never going to have more than we do right now, and there's going to be big problems. And I thought, wow, that sounds interesting and improbable. Let me get on Google tonight and check that out. And I entered my search term in Google, peak oil, and I know many of you have been there. I suddenly found myself in this dark, pre-apocalyptic netherworld of websites where our civilization's demise was a foregone conclusion and did not allow any room for optimism whatsoever. And you know, I know we're all here today because we do think that there's a lot that can still be done, but I think a lot of people get stuck in that world, and it's very incapacitating. And so, I mean, I hate to think that this much rests on Google and search engines, but really, until people are Googling peak oil and getting the balanced, nuanced, comprehensive coverage instead of just the doom and gloom sites, then I don't think we can say we're mainstream yet.
I think this is an inevitable step-by-step process. You know, at first, you know, this term wasn't out there. Now people are using it. And for example, now people are saying such and such is like peak oil. So it's a reference, it's a meme that's out there. So that's really good. The problem is, of course, the understanding is very shallow. It's basically the end of cheap oil, and we'll find a fix somehow for it. But as many of us believe, it's a lot deeper than that.
It's obvious as you look at some of the media coverage that it's changed quite a bit in a very short period of time. Here's an example from today's Sacramento Bee. The forum section is their opinion section. You can see the pictures there of the freeway interchange in Sacramento. This is an article written by Daniel Urch of Post Carbon Institute. That's not something that you would have seen, I think, even a year ago, certainly not 2 years ago. So you see an uptick in the amount of stories, and as we'll get into here in a little bit, it's not just the number of stories, but also the quality of the stories, the nature of the subjects they cover. Last year at this conference in Houston, oil went above $90 for the first time. A lot of us thought we were going to be crossing $90 again this past week in the other direction. Didn't quite make it. Now it's settled about 104. Clearly down more than $40 though from the high. I'm curious to know if the three of you think that we're going to go through a period of diminishing coverage about our oil situation because the prices are declining.
It's funny, I was at the OPEC meeting a week and some ago, and it was a curiosity that the last time they officially met, which is I think the 5th of March, oil was precisely at the same price as it was when we met a week and a half ago. And what a difference an upward trajectory makes compared to a downward trajectory in terms of psychology. And the whole sentiment there among the OPEC types was, you know, the sky is falling, and we've got to do something. In the end, well, you all probably know what they didn't do. But it's interesting how, you know, how we can view the same moment in the same reality, but depending on whether it's an upward arc or a downward arc, the psychology is completely different. Will it be diminishing coverage? I don't know. I mean, there's, you know, the ramp up was so much fun and so alarming, and one thing that I'd still like to try to figure out, depending on whether we settle at 90 or just kind of hover around in what I would call the pain-free zone, which I think we're more or less back into, is whether we'd be able to kind of identify the place where we should be that would be the optimal, doesn't do too much damage, but causes just enough, keen enough irritation to keep the attention level high, and the car's smaller, and all the various things that we all saw underway when oil broke 130 or 140. My sense is it's now somewhere around probably 115 or something like that. But even if you look at kind of like what the coverage was like, I think it was at about that level where the anxiety level got the highest and the coverage spiked the most.
Yeah, I'm pretty concerned that the regularity of media coverage is going to track prices pretty closely. I think the media has a pretty short attention span, not just on this story, but on any major story. I mean, it's been a monumental achievement getting the kind of consistent coverage we're seeing on climate change now. And people have been talking about climate change since, you know, the mid-'80s, and it's only now that there's like constant reports coming out, you know, of glaciers calving off all over the place and all the effects we're already seeing. That's why, you know, the media is able to keep its attention on it all the time. But I think it would be most journalists would be very happy just to see oil go back down, and then great, I don't have to write about that anymore.
Well, I'm especially interested in what happens in the alternative media, the oil drum, other websites, Energy Bulletin, of course. And what we've noticed is, you know, the price of oil goes up, our readership hits go up too. Price of oil goes down, our readership goes down. But it's like a ratcheting effect. It goes down, but it doesn't go all the way back down. So it's kind of up, down, up, but the gradual trend is up. So I think that's good, because when you're in, the media is one thing, and this alternative peak oil movement is another. And in this alternative movement, we have a chance to go into it a lot deeper. And the more people we can get into it, I think the more deeper understanding we can get.
Do you think the fact that people are praying for us next door is going to make it easier for us to solve the problem? Let's take a closer look at the work of some of these three people. I want to start with Neil King. He has what probably is the best vantage point imaginable for a reporter. He's the international energy reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Over the last several years, he's written stories on intelligence, foreign policy, international trade. He spent most of the 90s in Europe covering the post-Cold War changes in that continent. I want to ask you something, Neil, but let me set this up by talking about a couple of articles here. This is an article dated Monday, September 22nd, so that's tomorrow, but it's Barron's. It came out yesterday. The title of this article is, "And Now Some Good News, Courtesy of Oil. Energy, though just a small portion of consumer spending, can have a big impact on the economy. $90 oil could add 2 percentage points to GDP." That's an article that I assume you've seen that sort of thing many a time. Oil goes up, it's a tax on the economy. Oil comes down, economic activity is stimulated, and that's good. Well, here's an interesting piece from Thursday, 2 days before. The title of this article is "New Turnaround in Oil Prices Isn't All Good News. Demand Could End Impetus to Explore New Energy Sources." All right, those headlines once again. "And now some good news, courtesy of oil. New turnaround in oil prices isn't all good news." Both from Dow Jones, one from Barron's, one from Wall Street Journal, headlines taking you in the opposite direction. That second one is the less conventional take, that this turnaround in oil prices is not all good news. Neil, since you wrote this article, why don't you talk a little bit about what's not good about increasing oil or decreasing oil prices?
Well, I mean, I just basically wanted to make the point that at a certain level, and I guess it goes back to my point on the March 5th, what the price was then compared to now, that $85 a barrel now isn't exactly the same as $85 a barrel last year, for a whole bunch of reasons, because of increasing overheads and costs in a lot of different projects. And the day we wrote that story, it so happens that one of the big projects in Canada that's been sort of on the drawing board for a while announced that their prices had gone up like 50% forecast for the first phase of this big oil sands project, and that they were now saying that $100 a barrel was about what they needed oil to be to make the whole thing feasible. And considering what we're already relying on for oil sands oil, which I think is like 1.4 million barrels a day or something, and most of the forecasts going forward as to where we're going to be getting stuff, puts a fair onus on oil from Canada from that same area. And there were, Total, the head of Total had talked about the week before that some of their projects also required $90 a barrel. That was for their heavy oil stuff, but their offshore stuff required $80 or so. So the point really was I wanted really to make the point that if this goes down very far, we'll feel temporary relief, but increased future pain if a lot of these projects get shelved.
I asked each of the panelists to take a few minutes, 3, 5, 7 minutes, to talk about something that they found particularly interesting. Neil, what you mentioned was the perils of oil reporting, and you mentioned that this last year has been a very instructive one. So what have you learned, and what's difficult about this story?
I actually decided last night or on the flight over here just to sort of jot some things down, which I don't normally do, but it just makes it a little bit easier. It's obvious that this year has been probably the strangest ever in the oil business, in large part because we saw this extraordinary ramp up in prices not being driven at all by any geopolitical event, which has always been the case before. Airstrikes, the whole embargo, if there had been some explosion or some sort of war in the Strait of Hormuz, some attack on Iran. So looking at least from this point of view, right now, it seems to me that the main question is what lessons should we draw from this, and what has it taught us? And as a reporter, my question is, especially in front of an audience like this, is whether it is helpful to have a sort of guiding theology, speaking of church in the other room, that you live by, that you have some sort of like bigger concept of what the whole reality is, and has that animate your reporting. What makes the energy world so interesting to me, and I've come to know this well over the last year, is its various warring factions. Of course, there's people that are in this room, and I'm still not clear exactly whether it's peakniks, peakists, peak oil aware, or what the label might be, if there even is a label. And then there's to kind of create a diametric other side, the we will overcomeists, the we ain't seen nothing yet-ists, or whomever that believes that human ingenuity and technology will find decades of additional oil. And there's obviously a lot of other sects and subsects. But running alongside this is a sort of parallel universe of analysts, traders, speculators, and I would say most journalists who live in a much more kind of visceral, momentary world that's really divorced from the whole kind of big life and death question about what the ultimate supply level will be. It's a world that's driven much more by tomorrow or the next day. You know, if you look at AP or Reuters, their stories, it would be interesting if you could like add them up over months or years, because they don't really necessarily add up all that well, but it's kind of what you have to do. Oil goes up because oil went up today, blah, blah, blah percent, on the wings of militant attacks in Nigeria, or unexpectedly low, you know, reporting from the EIA on stocks. At the same time, the analysts are, you know, talking about crack spreads and hydrogen levels at various refineries and slumping demand that they might have spotted. And, you know, for the world of the traders, a lot of time it's just the momentum that matters, so that it's a technicals-driven thing and not really a fundamentals-driven thing. And I was saying, for a while there this summer, it seemed that Hubbard's peak was indeed rippling through the markets. There was even a time when Saudi's oil minister Ali Naimi talked about that, not that he thought it was, but that the world had become kind of gripped by the whole peak oil concept, which was in turn driving the markets. What interests me in this is whether the big debate, the big geological, theological feud over our ultimate fate can and should animate the what I call the short-term empiricists, the people that are kind of looking at the momentary or the weekly or the monthly. And I think, you know, it should, that for any of us, no matter what we're doing, it's helpful to kind of have your sense of like, you know, where did humans come from, and whether you're a Darwinist or something else is helpful. But at the same time, I think that there's some grounds for forgiveness or a little bit of slack for those of us in the mainstream media. Because in large part, though you can have, your reporting can become increasingly animated by the whole peak oil reality, it's hard to expect that it would be sort of the daily gist of, or the daily story content. We still have to cover the OPEC sessions, you know, the huge quarterly profit earnings, the various ups and downs on the NYMEX, and try to make sense of those. And certainly those, as we've learned this summer, are not all to be deciphered by looking just at you know, what supplies might look like 4 or 5 years from now. I do think the Journal, for those of you who have noticed it all, has done a pretty good job in the last year. I was just writing down some of the things that we did. We did a story in the fall looking at the whole debate over whether we'll ever be able to break beyond the 100 million barrel a day sort of ceiling, which are kind of among a whole school of thought, which may be reflected here, that's not so much a peak, but a kind of long-term plateau that we'll be bouncing around in. You know, I did a story looking at the debate within the kind of alumni club at Aramco that was kind of the reflection of the whole peak oil debate and what Saudi Arabia's own abilities were, and another that was looking at the big Correas oil field and the huge challenges to bring on what will probably be the last big super major field that we'll ever see come on stream over 1 million barrels a day. And I highly welcome any other tips on things that we should be doing along those lines. But the one thing that's interesting about the whole sort of panoply of coverage, and I think it's very much reflected in, I can see all kinds of people here in this room that I know who are doing their own bit in this whole thing. I look at it as kind of like a pointless painting that we're all adding our own dots to. And I mean, there's a lot of amazing work obviously done on the oil drum, a lot of the things that you all put on the Energy Bulletin. It kind of goes on. And we were talking a little bit earlier about the comments on the oil drum, which is one of the very few domains in the entire blogosphere where the comments are intelligent, interesting, and not like totally unreadably ridiculous. And they're actually, I think they mainly have capital letters and real life punctuation and all that stuff. But I did, you know, it's interesting on the other hand, the financial mess that we're in now is like a classic example of what I think, there is a human willful blindness that we could think of many examples where, in that case, I think all of us here could have certainly seen what we're facing now coming several years ago, even if we were the ones running out to get all these cheap mortgages. And there's an element to that kind of willful blindness that I think is one of the main things that everyone in this room has to kind of work against. Because as long as things are going well and oil then, or gas prices fall below $4 a barrel, ears start to close. And there were a lot of ears open among our readership, and certainly across the country, when oil was over when gas was over $4 a gallon. I think the operative price here is, of course, much more the price of gasoline and not the price of oil, because that's what people mainly care about. Yeah, I was in Paris last week talking to some people at the IEA, and this is not exactly a novel phrase, but I did think it was particularly good because it put it so well. One of the main people there said, our problem is that the supply is old and the demand is young. And I think that for a journalist, sort of like a mainstream journalist, I think that's the most succinct kind of credo that one can have, that kind of to animate what one does on a daily basis, because no matter when exactly all these various great charts that you can see in the oil drum and elsewhere, to what extent that moment comes and how steep the downfall is and so on, the reality of supply being old and demand being young is pretty obvious. The one last thing I wanted to say was, I think everybody has to be cautious, and this is maybe even a bit of advice, on the whole sort of consequences question. Because there's obviously, I had talked earlier about the various clashing schools, and there's also this whole sort of doomers versus the kind of arch optimists feud. And to me, there's reasons to draw, or interesting lessons to be drawn from both sides, and I think interesting ones. And that, I think the likelihood that our mass mobility culture or way of life is going to be kneecapped in some fashion in the next 10 years is fairly high. But I'm not sure that means we're all going to be, living off carrots in our backyard and fighting one another for their propane tanks and living like road warrior or something like that. The last thing I wanted to say, and this sort of goes to the fallibility question, which I think we should all, I've went way over 5 minutes, right? Okay. I organized a pool last November, where I was sort of hitting up everybody I knew, from Goldman Sachs oil people to oil ministers, if I could get them, to people at Aramco, et cetera, to just weigh in on the basic question of what will the price of oil be on the 1st of July. And it was astonishing how wrong we all were. I think on average, I added it all up and divided by the whatever, and the whole group was off by about 80%. And in July, and this of course depended on when exactly I hit up the people in July, considering that July was a pretty wild month. So if the people that gave me their picks on July 10th tended to say oil would be at a much higher price at the very last day of the year than the people who gave me their picks on July 20th. But it's going to be interesting to see whether any of us are even, how close to the reality we'll be at all. And I wouldn't be surprised if we were kind of equivalently wrong this time as we were the last time around. Anyway, those are my quick remarks.
I tried to describe Erica Etelson as an attorney earlier. She corrected me. She is a recovering attorney, a Berkeley mother, a social activist, an author, as I mentioned before, periodically for the LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Bay Area Guardian. She is the founder of the Berkeley Peak Oil Task Force, and one of the things that she's interested in is the quality of coverage of media, quality of media coverage of oil. There's a lot of coverage about oil, but in Erica's description, a lot of it overly optimistic, a lot of it understating the magnitude of the problem. I'd like to hear your ideas on that, please.
Well, I actually had a really long list of complaints about media coverage, but in the interest of time, and because I'm sure some of these things are going to come up anyway, I'm actually just going to jump to the last one on my list, which I actually think is the most important, and that has to do with how the story is framed. I think that most often what I see is the story is framed as the energy crisis is an industry problem, maybe an OPEC problem, but it does not have anything to do with government accountability. And as an activist, to me, it's all about government accountability. To me, the story of the century here is that the government has been on notice for decades that we are staring into the abyss with our over-reliance on fossil fuels, and it has done little to nothing about it. That is an incredible story, but we are really not asking people the hard questions and following up with them. And I'll give you the most egregious example of this. In 2005, the Hearst report came out that you're probably most all familiar with, commissioned by the, is Robert Hirsch here?
Yes, he
All
is.
right. Hello, welcome. And that was followed just a couple years later by the GAO coming out with its own report. Both of these reports could have and should have triggered front page headlines on every newspaper in the country saying, "Government predicts worst crisis in nation's history." I missed those headlines. In fact, I missed if there were really any articles at all. And to make matters worse, in the several years that have elapsed since then, there also hasn't been anyone going back to these government actors and saying, "Hello, these reports have been out for years now. What are you doing?" This is the job of journalists, as I see it. This could really get back to our tradition as muckraking investigative journalists, asking politicians the hard questions and forcing them to answer. But we've moved, sadly, pretty far away from that. And so I'm just going to tell you one slightly encouraging little story on that note. When I was writing my most recent article for the Chronicle, I contacted Senator Dianne Feinstein's office for comment. And I talked to her press secretary, and he gave me kind of the response I usually get, which is, "Peak what?" So I emailed him some backgrounders, including the Hearst report and the GAO report. And lo and behold, a couple weeks later, Senator Feinstein fired off a letter to Energy Secretary Bodman saying, "Hey, how about this GAO report? What are you doing?" And that's just little old me, Berkeley freelance journalist, contacting Senator Feinstein's office. And it really made me wonder, what if the New York Times reporters were calling her? What if the Washington Post reporters were calling her and asking for follow-up and comment? I think she could be calling for congressional investigation, congressional hearings on this. So it's just absolutely vitally important. As journalists, we play a role not just in transmitting the news to the public, but in asking the kind of questions that get questions asked higher and higher up the food chain, and can really shake things up that way, even if no article ever comes of it. It's just important to ask the questions. I find this too, just in my work as an activist for the city of Berkeley, where we have a citizen task force that's assessing our city's vulnerabilities to peak oil and gas and writing a report and a series of recommendations to the city. And it's just so interesting how, when we start calling the stakeholders in Berkeley, just the process of educating them and having the conversations with them, and having them go back to their people, we just have a sense that the awareness is really building right in Berkeley among city officials and among the public, and so that's just something I think we need to focus more and more. Industry is not going to somehow save the day with some great new high-tech green invention. It's really, this is fundamentally about every level of government getting its act together, doing its job, and doing it fast. I did want to talk, and maybe this isn't the right point, but maybe we can come back later to just some ideas I had about things people can do to help try and improve media coverage, but maybe we'll just, do you want me to do that now? Okay. So these are things that I think that most of us can do, whether we're journalists or just concerned citizens. One thing is to ask for meetings with the editorial boards of news organizations. I have actually seen this be pretty effective with other issues. If you really bring them up to speed and give a reputable briefing to them, that can have an effect on their coverage. Also, every major newspaper, and my guess is probably a lot of the smaller ones too, have an ombudsman's office, and that office, their job is to interact and receive feedback and criticism from readers. Early at the beginning of this year, I wrote a very, very long email to the Washington Post ombudsman, and I said, "Okay, you guys, you're totally missing this. Here's 10 angles on the peak oil story. I really want to see you start covering it." And probably more importantly, I actually posted this on the Post Carbon Institute website and asked other people. I gave them a sample letter. I said, "Here's the letter I sent. I want everyone who reads this to send a letter to the Washington Post and get them to cover this." And I actually got an email back from the ombudsman and ombudswoman, and she said, "Well, this is interesting. I'm going to forward this to our energy reporter." Well, lo and behold, 3 months later, that energy reporter came out with a 3-part series in the Washington Post called Oil Shock. And I don't want to take credit for that. I mean, there are many reasons why I'm sure that story came into being, including $4 a gallon gas. But I don't think it hurts at all for the ombuds offices to get that push and communicate that to the editors and reporters at the paper. Another thing I want to say is don't forget about local media. I do think we tend to get overly focused on the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times, and there are hundreds of other newspapers. There's local talk radio shows. There's local PBS affiliates that could be airing some of the movies about peak oil. So write your op-eds and letters to the editor and focus some of your efforts at the local level, because actually that is where a lot of the most exciting and interesting work is going on. It's like with climate change. At the highest levels of government, they're asleep at the wheel. But if you get down to the state and local level, you see community organizing and local city councils and all kinds of stuff going on that is extremely newsworthy and that I think would be great fodder for a regional or local paper. Another untapped market, this is kind of an odd one, but a couple months ago I got my alumni magazine from Columbia University, and the cover story was peak oil, and I couldn't believe it, and I tore it open, and then I realized why the cover story was peak oil was because a professor there, that's a big part of his work. And it occurred to me that, there's a lot of academics at a lot of colleges and universities out there. So go to your alma mater. Find out if there are any faculty doing work around this, and if there are, then try and get a story in your alumni magazine. Those magazines reach thousands, tens of thousands of educated people, so it could be helpful. I think another really untapped market, and it's pretty well reflected in terms of the demographics of this room too, are African American and Latino journalists. I have a sense, I don't really know, but I have a sense that this issue is really not on the radar screen, and there are a number of publications, that are very much targeted toward markets of communities of color, and these are communities that are going to be the first and hardest hit, and they deserve to know about it and have the highest quality coverage of the issue now. My last suggestion is kind of a stealth approach. If we can't convince the actual journalists to cover this, then let's try and get to the people who the journalists go to. So I'm talking about pundits, and I'm talking about the people who get interviewed for articles, and the people who appear on the Lair News Hour and Marketplace and all of the other shows. I mean, there's kind of actually a depressingly small crew that show up over and over and over again. And if we could really get some of them to start seeing things a little more through the peak oil lens, then they will do the work of delivering the message every time they're interviewed. And my last point is that there is actually a lot of good reporting and a lot of good articles out there, and I don't think that we make enough use of what's there. I know it's very easy to read a great article and then just bookmark it or clip it and put it in your file cabinet. Don't do that. Every time I see a really good article, I send it to everyone I know so that they don't think I'm crazy anymore. It's not just me. There's a story in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And when I say I send it to everyone I know, that also includes all of my elected officials at every level of government. And I would really encourage everyone to do the same. Thank you.
Anderson is someone a lot of us in this room owe a debt of gratitude to. He works very hard looking through energy stories and stories that have some connection to energy. They appear in Energy Bulletin. A lot of us are addicted to that publication. And I think one of the things that I've seen in there most recently is this connection between peak oil and other sorts of peaks. Bart has an interesting background. He's worked as a technical writer in Silicon Valley, but he's also developed this interest in permaculture, various aspects of agriculture. One of the things in particular that jumped out to several of us over the last year was this notion of peak phosphorus, an essential fertilizing element that has played a huge role in the Green Revolution and potential peak problems with that. Bart, I think you're going to take a little time here, and you have a PowerPoint set up here, do you, to talk about peak phosphorus and a few other things?
I'm afraid I over-prepared. I realize now there are a lot of people I agree with, so I don't have to make all the arguments that I was preparing to make. So I'll skip over those. The reason I got involved with this, my background is actually in journalism. And when I realized that peak oil was about to break, I thought, this is a story of the decade or the century. You know, I want to get in on this. So since 2004, I've been working pretty much full-time on Energy Bulletin. What we do is monitor mainstream publications, a lot of blogs, the old drum, try to get some general interest stories, not too technical, from a wide variety of viewpoints, all the way from doomer to detective fixers, Republicans to Democrats, communists to fascists, it's all there. One of the conclusions I've come to, two conclusions. First of all, the rise in consciousness has been astounding. I don't know if there's been anything like this ever. I'll give some examples later in the talk. And secondly, it really didn't come from the mainstream media. You know, mainstream media does some things wonderfully, but in broaching taboo subjects, that's not what it's made for. So what it really took to get the ball rolling was a massive volunteer effort. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So, you know, in the early part of the century, 2002, 2003, it was a pretty bleak situation. A little awareness of peak oil, media, government, industry, nobody was interested in talking about it. And more to the point, if you were interested, where would you go? You know, there weren't any regular sources of information. Now, around 2004, by this time, number of books, very good books, had been published, and there were some extraordinary individuals who had been working on this for a long time. Hubbard, of course, back in the 40s and 50s. I won't go over all the names here. You probably know them. What was the situation about this time in terms of the media? You know, very little media. The Energy Bulletin actually got started because of a remark of Richard Heinberg, an Australian activist, Adam Grubb, heard a speech that Richard gave, and he really wanted to do something. What could he do? And so Richard Heinberg said, you know, there's no place on the web where we can really put documents. So Adam was a web designer, so he designed the web Energy Bulletin site and began putting articles up. Now, this is a state of coverage back then. He could do this in his spare time. You know, there were so few articles, just about anything significant, or at that time we were just looking for any mention anywhere of peak oil. You know, we put it up or a link to it up. So things were pretty slow back then. Then around 2005, 2006, things really began to change. Instead of the lone eagle individuals, now some communities began to form. For example, ASPO-USA here in the United States. I know ASPO had been going strong other places, but that's when ASPO really became active as far as I know. The oil drum was formed. Post-Carbon Institute had saw an uptick in activity. And this is really important because now there are nuclei around which people can come to share ideas. You find somebody else that shares your concerns, really important. Another thing was that at this point, people started writing about it. Blogs started appearing. Some of them were technical, a lot of them weren't technical. People were afraid. There was the peak shrink. You know, if you have a psychological problem because of peak oil, it's a great place to go. Annie the Nanny up in Canada, you know, parenting problems related to peak oil. Wonderful stuff. Quite a few new writers. I mean, to me, it was, you know, I love this because even though I'm a journalist, I love fiction. And I'm not very happy with fiction and the state of writing. And all of a sudden, there are things that I was enthusiastic to read. You know, I loved it. And an interesting thing is, since that time, the people that have posted on Energy Bulletin and other places, I've seen about 24 books get into print, you know, from people like Sharon Astick, you know, who'd given up on publishing. To me, that's very encouraging. there's the information that was coming out, like the documentaries End of Suburbia, the government reports, like the Hirsch report and GA report. Now we have some much more solid, polished information that was out there. Okay, media, well, there were some more articles here and there, and you know, they did a fairly good job, spent a few paragraphs describing what Hubbard's Peak was. Here's one side, somebody from ASPO. Here's the other side, somebody from Sarah, and that's it. You know, they didn't go into the arguments very much, but you know, it was something. On the other hand, not in the big media, but in some of the local media, for example, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, they did some wonderful things. They had this great long series on energy and talked about peak oil, and because of that, they were recognized by the Columbia School of Journalism. So there were some heroes there. Okay, now in 2008, it's really exploded. You know, I did a Google search, you know, to look at the Google metrics, and in the week, I did it a week apart, and in that meantime, there were 160,000 more hits that appeared, and I think the most current number is 4.5 million hits, compared to about 50 or 500, you know, way back when it started. Well, there's so much material that we've basically given up trying to keep track of it all, and we've specialized maybe permaculture, cultural aspects of it, some of the more general things. We leave more technical things perhaps to the oil drum. Coverage is, you know, as you've noticed, has really improved in the past year or two. You know, there's some top-notch reporters on the job. You know, I love journalism, and you know, there is it just does my heart good, you know, to see something in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, you know, an educated, somebody who knows what they're talking about, well done. That's coming out now, and that's very impressive. A lot of this is due to the spike in oil prices, but as I mentioned, I think we've got a ratcheting effect where it's never going to go back down to where it was in the year 2000. Okay, so are we successful? Yeah, we've got a lot of hits. Industry, governments, especially local governments, are really getting interested here and there. Then we've got a lot of local groups, transition towns. If anybody wants to have a wonderful case study of how to do public relations, see what transition towns is doing. They're everywhere. I don't know how they do it, but that's one of the most successful efforts I've ever seen in getting publicity everywhere. Christian Science Monitor, I think, last week. Post-carbon outposts is another thing. Some of the local city peak oil groups, wonderful stuff. So, you know, is this successful? Well, people are talking about it, but as I mentioned earlier, the discussion isn't very deep. With the energy industry, you know, their code word for peak oil now is the end of cheap oil. Okay, well, that's something, but it's really pretty superficial. Okay, so what's going to happen? Well, I think for sure the peak oil movement is going to keep doing what it's been doing so far and what it's really good at. Monitor news events, comment on it. I really love ASPO-USA. Every week or so there's Tom Whipple's, Tom Whipple has one or two great columns. Some other people in ASPO have some other great commentary. I think that's really important because something comes up and then they provide a very good, well thought out response to it. That's excellent.
An ungodly hour of the day, too.
Yeah. Now, you know, from inside peak oil, it looks like, oh, you know, we're so weak, we're so disorganized. But outside, it's really interesting. There's a critic of peak oil. He's a oil, not a counselor, advisor, whatever, you know, makes money from telling people what to do in oil. So anyway, he was writing a hit piece on peak oil, and he described it as a well-oiled peak oil public relations machine. I mean, from outside, it must look very overwhelming. Some of the other things that the energy sites can do is really good at analysis. You know, biofuels come up, unconventional technologies. Are they really worth it? What are the pluses and minuses? It's hard really to have a good analysis in the media. And so I think that's one of the most important things that it can contribute. The other thing is working with media. You know, this alternative movement and media, we're not enemies. You know, we're all part of the doing the pointillist painting, or we're all part of an ecosystem with different niches. There are different things that we can do very well. We can't do what you do. We don't have access to fiber roll and the IEA and so forth. But on the other hand, there's things that we can do that are difficult for you. Okay, so what have we done right? I mean, one of the amazing things is there are all these people working for free, writing, doing research, communicating. Why do they do that? Why do we do it? Well, one of the reasons is this is a fun place to be. This is one place where you can find people that you share values with. If you do some good work, people recognize it and send attaboy letters, And when it's 2 o'clock at night, my wife is telling me to come to bed, an email comes in and says, "You're doing a great job," so I keep on until 3 or 4. One of the other nice things is it's fairly nonpartisan. It's really surprising given the state of American society, but we've got everybody in peak oil, from Roscoe Bartlett to some pretty far left people, and for some reason, I don't know why, it doesn't seem to matter that much. So that's really nice. It's a welcoming atmosphere. If you can, there are many sites that you can read, go on to, participate in, and even if you're a newbie, it doesn't matter. People will be glad to educate you. And then for those of us that crave intellectual stimulation, this is heaven. Somebody said it's like an ongoing graduate seminar. I've learned so much, about some things I don't really care that much about, other things that are really important to me. So, on the other hand, like everything, there's some limitations to the peak oil movement. First of all, a lot of what we do, it's all volunteer. Okay, what's the problem with that? People burn out after a while. Spouses complain, you've got to earn a living, you're tired all the time. So that's a problem there. The other thing is we're really limited to informing and persuading. We're not in government. We can't actually do things. So that's just a limitation. The other issue is that, and this is getting better, but still the demographics of peak oil are pretty narrow. It's white, men, technical professionals. And I look at the readership that we get. It's the United States, Canada, England, Australia, the English-speaking countries, some people in Europe, and that's about it. So it's pretty narrow. So what's coming next? First of all is the idea of, okay, here's energy and oil out here, but as we know, it's got ramifications in many other areas: climate, politics, economics, food and agriculture. So what we've had to start doing on Energy Bulletin is we have separate sets of headlines for example, when Joe Hansen has just co-authored a paper on climate change and peak oil. Okay, so we can cover that in climate. Or when Condoleezza Rice says that one of the things that surprised her most as Secretary of State is the politics of energy. She says it's warping diplomacy. So an aha moment. Okay, that's one area. Another direction is, okay, it's not just peak oil alone that's peaking, as we know. It's pretty obvious that natural gas, coal, uranium, the other fossil fuels, they'll be undergoing something similar to that. Okay, that needs a similar degree of attention paid to it as oil. It's not just fossil fuels, it's minerals. We were talking, I guess, at lunch today about one of the problems with thin film PVs, photovoltaics, is that they require indium. And how many more years do we have left of it?
13-year supply at current rates.
Yeah, so not so good. Okay, so I think Ugo Bardi did a long article looking at about 30 different minerals and what this state is. Fascinating, but I haven't seen much of that in the mainstream media at all. As John mentioned, I'm obsessed right now with phosphorus, because we have other sources of energy sources besides oil. But if we don't have phosphorus from some source, we won't have agriculture, and especially we won't have industrial agriculture. Just as with peak oil, everybody admits it's a limited resource. Everybody admits that it will run out someday, and that day is maybe 50 years from now, 100 years. It depends on who you talk to. But of course, as we know, it's not the end of the resource that's a big issue, it's the peak. So it was only, I think, 2 years ago that I saw the first paper on peak phosphorus. Okay, peak phosphorus is out there now. There's a group of Australian researchers that have started a website on peak phosphorus, but almost no coverage in the media about that. So I think that's something that'll be coming. Okay, you want? Okay. Just the same. This is slide. Sure. Okay. And the other thing is, you know, the demographics of peak oil are pretty small. There is a lot of the world that really isn't aware of it right now. I keep looking for stories from China or India, and I know that there's a China ASPO chapter, but since that announcement, I haven't seen much more since then. And I know something's going on, but you know, that's a big chunk of humanity. You know, what are they saying? What's going on there? Women. One of the things that's happened in the last year or two is there's been a tremendous uptick in the number of women writing about peak oil. What's interesting is, to me, is they take a very different outlook than conventional peak oil. Typically, it's more social, community-oriented. It's kind of nice. I enjoy that. The other problem is that right now, peak oil is pretty much expressed in terms of professionals. Leaves a lot of people out. Farmers, blue-collar workers, small businessmen. Artists, actually, it's strange. They're some of the ones that are most aware of it. They're the exception to the case. But otherwise, we're still pretty stuck in among technical professionals. And I'll stop.
We have about a half hour. I want to use the portable mic here so the direct sound will record easier. Any questions?
A question I have is, with all the discussion about oil drilling, there seems to be no discussion in the media that, well, most of the offshore areas don't have oil, and the areas that do are being drilled. Also, I've almost never seen any media connect peak oil to the occupation of Iraq.
We've taken various cracks at the, you know, how much do we really, I mean, how much is out there and where can we get it? It's funny because there's, of course, a lot of different schools of thought on that, and a lot of people rely on this USGS stuff that seems kind of guessworky in some areas, and some areas not. Obviously, there are certain things off the coast of California that we would know automatically because it was being pumped before. But there, I mean, maybe we haven't done enough. There still is, I think, the idea out there that the Republicans have been good at pushing that if only we could get out this stuff, it would make a material difference. And I mean, I'm not necessarily a believer that we shouldn't do it, but I don't also believe that it will really make a material difference. The only thing that will make a difference maybe is on the trade deficit, which is an important thing. I don't think it'll make a huge difference in the price of gas or that. Iraq, do you want?
I don't have anything to say on Iraq.
Yeah, that's always been a tricky one. I mean, I don't know. My sense on the Iraq thing is we wouldn't have invaded if it didn't have oil because we wouldn't have cared about it. But did we invade it in order to get the oil? I'm not so sure. And so far, it hasn't really led to, if that was the case, it hasn't done us much good so far. But I'm sure there'll be other people that have totally different views. In the end, I don't know. What would have been the contrary reality if we hadn't gone in? Probably we would have had slightly less oil than we do now.
Let's take a question over here from Professor Aleclet from ASPO Europe.
We touched something here that is important, and that is that the big fraction of the world don't speak English in general. And that's just what happens in China. I mean, they have a yearly conference like the one that you have with the same amount of participants. And of course, they are writing reports about that, but unfortunately, it's in Chinese and you don't understand it. And the same thing is with many other countries. They have things going on in their languages. And it looks like always, if it's not in English, it's not worth discussing it. And again, translation of materials to many different languages. That might be the next step when taking these things more internationally. So a pool of people that are interested to do translations from one language to another is an addition that you should have to the Energy Bulletin.
Thanks. Other questions here?
I'm an energy journalist myself. I've written a book about peak oil, and I write regularly on peak oil. My name is Chris Nelder, and one of the things that's really frustrated me is the fact that so much media coverage is just factually wrong or fundamentally factually confused about the subject. And out of frustration, a few months ago, I wrote something called the Peak Oil Media Guide, where I was trying to get this out to people in the media to say, you know, at least let's agree on some very fundamental concepts and some fundamental numbers and try to reduce the boundary of the discussion a little bit, so we're not, you know, on the one hand talking about 1 trillion barrels of recoverable versus 12 trillion barrels of original oil in place, and leaving the audience completely confused as to why one guy's saying 1 and the other guy's saying 12. So from your perspective of being in the media, what can we do to improve the factual quality of the reporting, and how could I be more effective in getting that media guide or other similar materials in front of journalists in order to make that improvement?
Well, I would just actually go back to a suggestion I had earlier, which is to take that media guide to the editorial boards of news organizations. That's exactly the kind of thing they need, because then, you know, if you get them to understand that, then when they have reporting that goes outside those bounds and is factually inaccurate, they'll have editors who will actually know that and say, oh, actually, this is wrong. Go back and tell the story correctly.
Here's one suggestion, is sometimes you can write to the reporter directly. I think that's really, that can be very effective. And when you do, it's really good not to be accusatory, or not to say that they're incompetent and so forth. You try to be gentle and helpful. That's very much appreciated. I think that would be effective.
Yeah, I agree. I totally respond to, you know, sane, normal, rational emails, which I get a lot. I mean, I found some of the most useful people that I then continue to interact with through that avenue, and I totally welcome being corrected, or have, because it's usually, if you're corrected on something, it opens up like a whole area that you weren't necessarily aware of. And I mean, there are a lot of these kind of established fallacies that get repeated all the time, and part of the problem is that people dabble in it, and it's also a fairly kind of bifurcated reporting area, where there are like the wire reporters who look at it very up close, like I was talking about before, and there aren't that many that necessarily have the leisure to kind of look at the bigger sweep picture. And even within those, people may move into it briefly and then move back out of it again and only be there for a while. It is a challenge. I think what you point to is kind of the overall need, which somebody should do. It would be almost the kind of thing that you would get at the gas pump. There would be like a little holder, and there'd be these little pamphlets, and would be something that would kind of explain to like the normal folks sort of what the reality is, and that, you know, we, especially as Americans, I think we really come to believe that it's our God-given right to have gas under $4. And you saw some of the totally wild comments being made around June or July. I could name the people in Congress that were making them, that were kind of getting at that point. Like, you know, I mean, you know, this, who are the Saudis to not pump more of their oil for us? You know, there's a lot of that kind of thing that goes through the body politic, and it's that whole strand is a little disturbing.
I have a question from back here.
Hi, Jan Lundberg with Culture Change. It's great to be hearing these points. I wanted to take up the issue of directing media stories or activism toward government. I think we should distinguish between local government and larger government levels. I went to your mayor, Bates, in Berkeley, about peak oil in 2005, and the issue of plastics as an aspect of petroleum was much more interesting to him, and that's as far as it went at that time. I wanted to say in general, though, that to expect action from government on peak oil and the general whole sphere changes we're seeing that are accelerating may be misplaced, and that taking action without government is a very important theme for citizens to understand. No one's going to come and save them from the government. From the government isn't going to come out and save them from peak oil. And I think we've sort of, sensed that.
Yeah, my name is Jeremy Leary. I'm one of the organizers with the grassroots group Portland Peak Oil. We're the group that petitioned for the City of Portland's Peak Oil Task Force. We've had some success interacting with the local media, the Oregonian, the Willamette Week. 2 points of my frustration was when we did get that, like my friend Randy was on the front page of Willamette Week, he had this big write-up and it basically turned into a human interest story. And the write-up we had in the Oregonian was mostly human interest story. And the two parts that were, in addition, that were somewhat maddening about that is, one, I try to get the point across that it seems too often in the media that when they say some really large number with a lot of zeros, that it appears to roughly equate with forever. Like we have, if there's a 4 billion barrel find, great, how long would that last? I mean, just a simple class and long division would seem to indicate that this is not that good of news. And the other part is there's a linkage between emergency response and sustainability that's not getting nearly enough play, especially from the permaculture angle. There's all sorts of things you can do to improve local community resilience. I mean, the transition sounds touch on a fair bit of it. It's just there's a linkage there that when I've wandered out to the local gun show, I can talk about emergency response and have it be in the same context as sustainability. So, anyways.
Let's try this again. Does anybody have a question? That's a question.
I work with economists a lot, and I think one of the big problems we have in getting really mainstream is if you could get economists to believe that there's peak oil. It's the rare economists that, and I run across a lot in my work, that believe there's peak oil. And it is a big obstacle in getting anybody to listen to you in government or otherwise.
Okay.
Could I respond to
Yes,
that?
yeah, sure.
The economists are a hotbed of opposition. They are not our friends, basically. However, if you look around, you will find some rebels, and they will come out and speak. And that's very important to get to, find among all the economists those few that understand it and are willing to speak.
One thing that's been interesting to me is that over the last 6 or 7 months is the idea, or it would even seem to be the reality, that huge sectors of the American economy was totally oblivious to the possibility of what may be not far over the horizon. I mean, it's like every part of the economy obviously would be hurt in huge ways. And we saw the airlines fumbling around this summer to try to deal with it. And I know there are various efforts being made, and there have been a lot of kind of behind the scenes conversations that people have had with a lot of the investment funds and the pension funds and the mutual funds and stuff like that, where I think the word has started to get out that there is this thing that could like totally rock the U.S. economy, but I don't think it's really percolated up yet, and I agree that it's certainly not being reflected in the thinking of normal economists.
Does anyone know if who's the guy who wrote Freakonomics?
Rubin.
I forget his name, but he's, his tagline is like, the rogue economist, and there's a whole Freakonomics website now, and I think it's really well read, and was occurring to me recently that he would be a great person to brief on this if he doesn't know it already.
Another one is Paul Krugman. Anybody
He's-
catch that?
he's written about it, yeah.
He was apparently following the oil drum for a while.
Okay.
So maybe we could jump on him while he's interested.
Mike?
The New York Times columnist.
Okay, this is a question directly for Neil King, because you're the big enemy here. Okay, you're the corporate journalist, and my tongue is firmly in my cheek. Okay, let me set the question up. I'm watching CNN in June, and they're doing this big thing about, this was when the Saudis had their meeting that was a quiet meeting and everybody flew to Saudi Arabia. And CNN, Ali Velshi is doing, now we have to put pressure on the Saudis to increase production. We're starting to demonize the Saudi government. They cut to a commercial, and the commercial is for their documentary, We Were Warned, with the cover of Matt Simmons' Twilight in the Desert. In the commercial, immediately following the segment about how evil the Saudis was for not increasing production. Now, CNN knows who I am. I wrote a book, had something to do with oil. It's still selling pretty well. Doing another. Within, I said, are you guys out of your mind? You're blaming them for not increasing production. You're promoting a show that says they can't increase production. Clearly, somebody needs some drugs in the management level to mood stabilize or deal with a mental issue. When I read the Wall Street Journal, if Mark Rasko or whoever's governor of Montana does a story saying there's 2 trillion barrels of recoverable oil in the coal in Montana, will keep America running forever with clean coal and grow the economy, so many lies in there, I don't want to get to it. That winds up page 1 above the fold, column 1. If there's a story about energy investment problems plague shale oil development, it's page 22 below the fold. What's happening? Is anything happening at the Wall Street? Using you as an example, I'm just picking you out, and I want to. The subsequent question is, has it changed since Murdoch has bought it? Is your editorial policy evolving to show a little more enlightenment?
Yeah, I would actually have to disagree with what you're saying. And for one, I guess you're throwing that story out as a hypothetical. I don't remember any story like that. I mean, I could say, just this, we had a big story that was on the front page about the IEA report that's coming out in November, which for all I know could be even more startling than what we said it was going to be in May or whatever on these huge decline rates worldwide. We have a story that somebody's working on now about, I think it's a Chevron project in offshore Brazil that they've spent just gazillions of dollars on that's going to get them about 8,000 barrels a day. That's basically, here's this unbelievable project that's going to get them just piddly amounts of oil. We've had stories about the incredible difficulties of getting into the oil sands. I did this big story on the Correas field, which is pointing out this is the last big one that we're probably ever going to see in our lifetime, and it's one hell of a pain in the ass to get that oil out with massive amounts of water they're pumping in from the Gulf and all this kind of stuff, and it's not stick a straw in the sand time anymore. I don't know, I'm not tooting our own horn, but I think we've done tons of stories along those lines. We could do more, and I welcome other input on things that any of us should hit on in that line. No, there's certainly no ideological change of focus at the Journal. There's definitely a change of focus that's much more now. It's a more kind of urgent thing than we used to have in the past. I mean, we just had 5 days in a row of across the entire page headlines. I think in our entire history we might have run 10 of those, which includes D-Day and 5 other.
Let's take another question here, Ron.
Yeah, I'm Ron Swenson. I think I have the oldest website on peak oil, oilcrisis.com. Anyway, well, thank you. 1994, when the web was young. There are 2 big issues, of course. One is climate change, and the other is peak oil. What we're seeing, going beyond urgency to panic, is a move towards coal to liquids, shale, tar sands, extreme offshore, desperate measures. On the other hand, on the solar side, renewable side, there's a lot of dissing going on. You can look at just about every book on peak oil and somebody's saying solar is diffuse, it's expensive, it's this, it's that. Clearly misunderstanding that renewables in the final analysis are all we have to work with. Let's face it. So I'm wondering if you are seeing any delineation in these press events and the stories that are coming out, the journalism coming out, showing that that there is a difference between going towards from peak oil towards other liquids, and maintaining the automobile at its 10% efficiency and so forth, versus on the other hand going to like Al Gore saying 100% renewables in 10 years. Are people making those connections in the press? I haven't seen it yet much.
I think it's just really mixed. I mean, it's so diverse, and especially on that question. So I don't know even if I've seen any change. There's a lot more activity in renewables. Some people are and some people aren't. I don't see any clear trend or picture.
There is a lot. Actually, on the way out here, I read the Atlantic, and it was unbelievable just flipping through. I would say 95% of all the ads in this month's Atlantic were all energy ads. And then they had quite an interesting spread, actually. It was a full 2-page thing on where all the wind turbines are now. I wasn't aware of some of like the whole South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota line. And but it also dwelt a lot on the difficulties, transmission lines, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I think it's probably helpful that people are at that stage, because I think the one thing that people aren't really getting is there isn't going to be this easy thing that we just, segue over to and everything's fine. That no matter whether renewables like this are going to be good or not, we have a lot of work to do to make them fit into the overall economy.
Let's take a question over here.
Hi, I'm John Cooksey from How to Boil a Frog is the website I run. And so intelligent oversimplification is my business. And I noticed you brought up framing, like George Lakoff. And even in ASPO's stuff, in the packets, it says the peak oil theory says this and the peak oil theory says that. At what point do we stop saying the peak oil theory, which is what's thrown back in our faces? Yeah, there's a theory about peak oil. At what point can we, and how do we say, no, this is just a fact. This is happening.
I think it's a great point. I'm not sure I have an answer to what point that would be, but it's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think, right, maybe when everyone's really aware that we're there, we don't have to keep saying that. Well, we're already too late.
Let's go to something else here.
Hi, I have another question about framing. You're all talking about the move into mainstream media. And I come from Israel, and we've been trying to convey the story. And the problem that I have found is that even if you try and convince the reporter and he actually buys the story, then he asks, okay, what is the solution? And if you start talking about permaculture, and then, well, you're not the lunatic speaking about peak oil, but then permaculture, what's all about that? And then you will lose all coverage. And I'd like to hear your comments or thoughts about it.
I talk about permaculture in my articles. I don't call it permaculture because I do want to get published. But, I do talk about this idea that we have to really think about living our lives fundamentally differently, that this is about community, this is about relearning old skills around food cultivation and do it yourself. I mean, I do talk about that, and it's not under the banner of permaculture, but I think you can, it's a little like the question you raised, do you use the term peak oil? Do you use the term permaculture? No, but you can definitely talk about all of those things.
I'm a teacher, and one of the things, it's really hard to get the peak oil story across, but my question to you is, how difficult is it to cover peak oil when you can't get a politician to talk about it because there is no simple solution? In other words, peak oil doesn't have a happy ending, and journalists don't like to write stories that don't have happy endings, and politicians won't talk about a story that doesn't have a solution.
Yeah, I had spent a little bit of time with Roscoe Bartlett, who I assume most of you know who he is, representative from Maryland, and he's given now 120 or whatever of these speeches on the House floor at 7:30 at night with his 100 of these big flip charts, and it's like the loneliest endeavor, and it's also, politically speaking, there's like no upside really to it at all, to be sort of a Cassandra, like life's going to be miserable, the entire American way of life is coming to an end, we've got to do something about it. I think it's responsible, to say the least, but I agree with you totally that it's kind of a loser's game on the politics side. And it's funny, like, what is this peak oil caucus? It's like 18 people, and they kind of meet every now and then and have coffee or something. And it's trying to get some life, but they've never really pushed any particular piece of legislation that I know of or anything. So I agree that it's a hard thing to base a political career on.
I think two things. It's a huge problem. Like Jan Lundberg's newsletter says, it's culture change. Culture is horribly hard to change. So, we've got to try this. There've got to be a lot of different approaches. One thing about Roscoe Bartlett, he does do that. But if he also matches that, he's got down-home, small-town, conservative, we can do it, some very positive sentiments. I just love him for that, because he combines the horrors of peak oil with a real faith in what people can do.
back in 2004, a woman at UC Davis wrote her senior honors thesis, 2004-2005, on peak oil as an underreported story. Liz Warren, I don't know if you ever thought we'd see this with all this many people talking about this issue.
One thing I wanted to ask is I can't inspire a lot of my peers to be interested in the topic, and is, even the younger generation below me right now isn't informed on the topic. So I wondered if you have any recommendations. What I wrote about in my thesis was we have this need to be entertained. And so a lot of entertainment venues that are kind of news venues like The Daily Show or just late night talk shows have been a good way to get people interested in the topic. But I wondered if you could speak to how we can get peak oil more in those venues, or if you have any other ideas on how to inspire youth.
Well, oh. Okay, I thought he was going to take another question. Well, this goes back to the P word, permaculture again. I actually think one of the most exciting youth movements happening right now is sustainable agriculture. I mean, there are more and more young people just absolutely flocking to permaculture and other kinds of programs, and they're running community gardens and doing just all kinds of amazing stuff. Now, a lot of them aren't necessarily there because of peak oil, or may not even have heard of it, but it's a very receptive group because they're already part of the solution, and then you get them to start understanding and seeing the ways in which what they're doing is part of the solution, and that could actually feel exciting to them because it's not coming at it from like, here's this horrible problem that's going to ruin your life. It's like, hey, here's this problem and you guys are great, you're already doing the right thing, and let's put it in context. It's beautiful.
Remember the whole series of the woman who was like strip teasing, and the things on YouTube was doing like the strip tease and talking about peak oil at the same time? I don't know if you've seen those things, but they're very funny.
Yeah. And we got about 1 minute left. Let's finish with a question from Jeffrey Brown, a.k.a. West Texas.
I guess, Erica, you're lucky I don't have your email address. The other two gentlemen flanking you have gotten about dozens of emails from me. And I want to thank all three of you for what you're doing. But Neil, I had a question for you specifically. Without naming names or breaking confidences, do anyone in like the IEA, government officials that talk to you in private, do they express more pessimism about fuel supplies in private to you for off-the-record discussions than they do in public?
Remember, I think a bunch of us caught up, kind of like stopped momentarily and all like looked around at one another when Bush was in Saudi Arabia and he was on this television interview, and somebody said, well, why didn't you push the king harder to supply more oil? And he said, well, you can't ask them to do what they might not be able to do, or something. And it was more or less that line, and it was like, wow. And that really spread around, and I think there's actually a lot more belief along those lines than meets the eye. I certainly think that's the case at the IEA, and I think there are folks at the Department of Energy that are of that mind too. I'm not saying that's like some huge conspiracy to keep a growing consensus silent or whatever, but I think there are people that are certainly thinking about it, and that it seems to be spreading.